Show us then, SEAL.
Sweat stung her eyes, smelling of copper and cheap tactical soap. 79 seconds. That's all it took to dismantle 4 apex predators in a damp concrete box. Not with grace. With ugly, desperate violence. Welcome to the reality of the Trident, where proving you belong means leaving bodies on the floor. Humid air hung thick in the subterranean staging room, tasting like stale coffee and weapon solvent. Harper sat on a rigid metal bench, her fingers methodically working the stiff Velcro of her plate carrier. Every tear of the fabric echoed sharply against the cinder-block walls. Her shoulders ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, a souvenir from a rough, fast rope insertion 3 days prior. She was 32, but in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light, she felt 50. The base, an old Soviet-era bunker in eastern Poland retrofitted for NATO Joint Task Forces, offered zero comforts. It just offered dampness that seeped into the marrow. She dropped the heavy ceramic plates onto the rubberized floor with a dull, heavy thud. For a brief second, Harper closed her eyes, letting the chill of the underground facility cool the heat radiating from her neck. She didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want to be the subject of hushed conversations in the chow hall. She just wanted to clean her Sig Sauer, eat a lukewarm MRE, and sleep for 6 hours. The heavy steel door at the end of the locker bay scraped open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Heavy boots slammed against the grating. 4 men walked in. Harper didn't need to look up to know who they were. The smell of chewing tobacco, strong spearmint gum, and arrogant cologne preceded them. It was a joint op reconnaissance team. Hotshots. Guys who had spent the last 3 weeks treating her presence on this base like a bureaucratic clerical error. Wyatt was at the front, a towering guy from a specialized mountain division who moved with the loose, swinging gait of a man used to taking up too much space. Behind him were Bennett, Cole, and Lawson. They were all wide shoulders, tattooed forearms, and eyes that held the perpetual squint of men who thought violence was a game they had already mastered. Harper kept her gaze on her gear, dragging a solvent-soaked rag through the upper receiver of her rifle. The fumes were sharp, burning the back of her throat. Didn't think they let the PR department use the live-fire kill house, Wyatt said. His voice was a low rumble, bouncing off the concrete. Harper didn't pause her cleaning. Range was open, Wyatt. Just getting my reps in. Bennett snorted, leaning against the gray metal lockers. The metal buckled, slightly under his weight. Reps. Right. Tell me, when you guys do your little Bud-esque documentary shoots, do they give you lighter logs to carry? Harper felt a familiar, exhausting knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't fear. It was sheer, profound annoyance. It was the absolute weariness of having to justify the air in her lungs every single day. She set the upper receiver down on the oily mat. She didn't look at them defensively. She just looked tired. I carry the same weight you do, Bennett, Harper said, her voice flat, devoid of the emotional reaction they were so desperately fishing for. Lawson, a stocky operator with a buzz cut and a jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset poorly, stepped forward. He reached out, his thick fingers hovering over her disassembled M4. Careful, Harper murmured, her tone dropping an octave. It's wet. Lawson ignored her, picking up the heavy lower receiver. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting it with a mocking sneer. Clean. Almost like it's never been used outside a controlled environment. You know, we've got a bet going in the barracks. Half the guys think you passed the standards. The other half think they lowered the standards so the brass could get a magazine cover. And which half are you in, Lawson? Harper asked, finally standing up. She was 5'9", solidly built, but next to the 4 of them, the size discrepancy was a stark, undeniable reality of biology. I'm in the half that thinks if you took away the gun and the fancy night vision, you're just a liability waiting to get someone killed, Lawson replied, taking a deliberate half step into her personal space. He smelled like sour sweat and stale nicotine. Harper held her hand out. "Give me the weapon." Lawson didn't hand it back. Instead, he tossed the lower receiver to Cole, who caught it with a hollow clatter. "Oops," Lawson smiled, showing a chipped front tooth. "Looks like you're disarmed. What now, Frogman?" Harper's chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled breath. She felt the cold sweat prickling at her hairline. The logical part of her brain, the part trained to de-escalate, to focus on the mission, to ignore bruised egos, screamed at her to walk away, to report it, to be the bigger person. But looking at the 4 sets of eyes staring back at her, filled with a primal, dismissive contempt, she knew walking away wouldn't end it. It would only validate their narrative. The locker room felt suddenly very small. The hum of the lights grew deafening. Wyatt crossed his arms, leaning over her. "Yeah. Show us then, SEAL. No guns, no brass watching, just us. Show us why you belong in the same room as us." Harper looked at her empty hands. Her knuckles were scarred, the skin dry and cracked from the weather. She didn't feel a heroic surge of adrenaline. She just felt a cold, miserable certainty about what was going to happen next. It was going to be ugly. It was going to hurt. And she was going to have to do it. 79 seconds, she whispered, almost to herself. "What's that?" Wyatt asked, leaning in closer. Harper moved before Wyatt finished his question. She didn't throw a cinematic right hook. She didn't scream. She stepped directly into his center of gravity, driving her lead foot behind his ankle, and slammed the heel of her palm upward into the soft cartilage of his nose. The sound was a wet, sickening crunch. Wyatt's eyes rolled back instantly, a spray of red misting the air between them as his knees buckled. He went down hard, his head bouncing against the rubberized floor with a dense, hollow thud. He didn't move. 1 second. The remaining 3 froze for a fraction of a heartbeat. That was the reality of unexpected violence. The brain requires a moment to process a shift from posturing to actual, brutal combat. Harper didn't need to process. She was already inside the chaos. Bennett lunged from the left, a massive, looping arm aiming to tackle her around the waist. Harper didn't try to block a man 80 pounds heavier than her. She dropped her weight, pivoted on her bruised knee, and let his momentum carry him past her. As he rushed by, she slammed her left elbow down onto the back of his neck, right where the helmet would normally sit. Bennett grunted, stumbling forward into the metal bench. Before he could recover, Harper grabbed the thick fabric of his plate carrier, used it as leverage, and drove her knee squarely into his floating ribs. She felt something give way beneath the heavy canvas. Bennett let out a sharp, breathless wheeze, dropping to his hands and knees, spitting saliva onto the floor. 12 seconds. Cole and Lawson were reacting now. Realizing this wasn't a scuffle, it was a fight for survival. Cole dropped her weapon parts and charged, while Lawson hooked left to flank her. Harper backed up, creating space. Her lungs burned. The tactical soap smell was gone, replaced entirely by the copper scent of Wyatt's blood and the sharp tang of adrenaline. Her left shoulder flared with agonizing pain as she raised her arms. She was imperfect. She was hurting. This wasn't a movie where the hero felt no pain. Cole threw a wild, heavy punch. Harper parried it, but the sheer force of his arm sent a shockwave down her forearm. She slipped inside his guard, but Cole was fast. He grabbed a fistful of her uniform shirt, yanking her forward. Harper didn't pull back. Pulling back was a mistake against a larger opponent. She drove forward, using her forehead to smash into the bridge of Cole's nose. It was a sloppy, desperate headbutt. Pain exploded behind her eyes, a bright flash of white light blinding her for a millisecond. She tasted her own blood in her mouth. She had bit her tongue on impact. Cole staggered back, clutching his face. Harper didn't wait for her vision to clear. She kicked, low and hard, her combat boot sinking into the side of his knee joint. Cole screamed, a ragged, ugly sound, and collapsed sideways, clutching his leg. 45 seconds. Lawson was on her. He had bypassed the striking phase and went straight for a grapple, wrapping his thick arms around her torso from behind, pinning her right arm. The air was forced from her lungs in a violent rush. He squeezed, trying to crush her ribs, trying to lift her off her feet. "Got you, you bitch," Lawson hissed, his hot, sour breath wet against her ear. Panic fluttered in Harper's chest, the primal, suffocating fear of being trapped. She couldn't outmuscle him. Her ribs groaned under the pressure. She had to break the grip. She stomped down with her right heel, aiming for his instep, but missed, her boot glancing off his shin. Lawson tightened his grip, cutting off her diaphragm. Black spots danced in the corners of her vision. Breathe. Think. Harper dropped her chin, sinking her teeth into the thick, sweaty meat of Lawson's forearm. She bit down, with every ounce of primitive force her jaw could muster. Lawson roared in pain, his grip loosening just a fraction of an inch. It was all she needed. She forced her left arm up, sliding her hand behind Lawson's head. She found his eye socket with her thumb and pressed in, hard and merciless. Lawson shrieked, instantly letting go of her waist to grab at his face. Harper spun around, gasping for air, her lungs burning as oxygen flooded back in. She didn't hesitate. As Lawson stood blinded and panicked, she grabbed the collar of his shirt, stepped across his body, and executed a messy but forceful hip throw. Lawson hit the concrete floor hard enough to knock the remaining wind out of him. Harper didn't stop. She dropped her shin directly onto his sternum, pinning him to the floor, and brought her fist down on his jaw. Once, twice. His head lolled to the side. The fight was over. 79 seconds. Harper stood up slowly. The locker room was dead silent, save for the ragged sounds of breathing. Wyatt was out cold. Bennett was on the floor, clutching his ribs, groaning in agony. Cole was rocking back and forth, holding his knee. Lawson stared at the ceiling, eyes glazed, chest heaving beneath her bootprint. Harper's whole body trembled. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a cold, nauseating exhaustion. Her head throbbed from the headbutt. Her tongue bled. Her shoulder felt like it had been hit with a hammer. She felt no triumph, no righteous vindication, just a profound, dirty sadness. She walked over to where Cole had dropped her lower receiver. She picked it up, her hands shaking so badly the metal rattled. She snapped it back onto the upper, pushed the takedown pins in, and locked the bolt to the rear. The metallic click echoed loudly in the room. She slung the rifle over her back. She didn't look at the men on the floor. She just grabbed her gear bag and walked toward the heavy steel door. "Next time," Harper said, her voice raspy, a slight lisp from her bitten tongue. "Leave my weapon alone." Footsteps fell heavy on the grated steel walkways of the bunker's secondary corridor. Harper walked with a deliberate, measured gait, suppressing the urge to limp. Her right knee throbbed where it had collided with Cole's shin, a hot, localized pain that flared with every shifting of her weight. She didn't look back at the staging room. She just kept her eyes focused on the endless procession of overhead fluorescent tubes, counting the flickering ones to keep her mind tethered to the present. The adrenaline crash was hitting her now, absolute and merciless. It felt like a heavy, wet blanket draped over her shoulders. Her hands, shoved deep into the pockets of her tactical trousers, still vibrated with a faint, uncontrollable tremor. She hated that tremor. It was an involuntary biological betrayal, a reminder that no matter how much conditioning she underwent, her nervous system was still wired like any other human being's. She reached her quarters, a retrofitted shipping container shoved into the corner of a massive subterranean bay. The metal door stuck in its frame, requiring a sharp, aggressive shove with her good shoulder to break the seal. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, smelling of ozone from the struggling space heater and damp wool from her spare blankets. Harper dropped her gear bag onto the narrow cot. The canvas slapped against the thin mattress with a dull smack. She didn't turn on the overhead light, preferring the dim, ambient glow bleeding in through the single reinforced window slot. Carefully, meticulously, she began to strip off her outer layers. Every movement required calculation. Peeling the sweat-soaked combat shirt over her head pulled at the strained muscles in her neck, drawing a sharp, hissed breath through her teeth. She tossed the shirt into a corner, standing in her olive-drab undershirt. She walked over to the tiny, rusted metal sink bolted to the wall. She turned the tap. The pipes groaned, spitting a stream of rust-tinted water before running clear and freezing cold. Harper cupped her hands, bringing the icy water to her face. It shocked her system, stinging the cut on her lower lip. She spat a mixture of saliva and faint pink blood into the drain. The metallic taste of her bitten tongue still lingered, a stubborn reminder of the sheer ugliness of the last half hour. Leaning close to the scratched mirror, she inspected the damage. Her left cheekbone was already turning a mottled shade of violet. Her eyes looked hollow, ringed with exhaustion. She didn't look like a victor. She looked like someone who had barely survived a car crash. A sharp, authoritative knock hammered against the metal door. 3 rapid strikes. Harper closed her eyes, letting out a long, slow exhale. She grabbed a clean towel, wiped her face, and walked over to unlatch the door. Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds stood in the hallway. He was a man carved from old, hard wood, his face a map of deep creases and perpetual annoyance. He didn't wear his rank on his sleeve. He wore it in the absolute stillness of his posture. He smelled faintly of black coffee and CLP gun oil. "Chief," Harper said, her voice raspy, keeping her hand on the doorframe. Reynolds didn't ask for permission. He stepped past her into the cramped chew, forcing Harper to step back. He surveyed the tiny space, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on her bruised face, before settling on the gear bag on the bed. "I just spent the last 20 minutes in the medical bay," Reynolds began, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "Listening to a medic explain to me why Wyatt needs to be medivaced to Ramstein for reconstructive facial surgery." Harper crossed her arms over her chest, protecting her aching ribs. She didn't say anything. There was no point in preemptive defense. "Bennett has 2 cracked ribs," Reynolds continued, ticking the injuries off on his fingers. "Cole has a hyperextended knee and torn ligaments. Lawson has a severe corneal abrasion and a concussion. They look like they got run over by a striker. They were conducting unsanctioned combatives in the staging room, Chief. I was simply participating in the exercise." Reynolds sighed, a deep, tired sound that seemed to drain the air from the small room. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled tin of mints, popping one into his mouth. The sharp smell of wintergreen briefly masked the ozone of the space heater. "Don't give me the bureaucratic bullshit, Harper. You broke 4 guys from the 10th Mountain Reconnaissance Attachment. Guys who were supposed to be our forward eyes on the border tomorrow. They took my weapon, Chief." The words hung in the freezing air between them. Harper's voice hadn't raised in volume, but the density of it shifted. She let her arms drop to her sides, exposing the bruising on her neck. "Lawson secured my lower receiver and refused to return it. They cornered me. They made their intentions clear. I neutralized the threat and recovered my gear. 79 seconds. That's how long it took." Reynolds stopped chewing his mint. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the slight shift in her stance, favoring her left leg. He saw the dried blood flaking on her knuckles. He had been in the teams for 22 years. He knew the difference between a bar fight and a survival response. "I know what they are," Reynolds said quietly, the harshness fading from his tone, replaced by a grim pragmatism. "I know how they look at you. I know the jokes they make in the mess hall. You think I don't hear it? But you are under a microscope, Harper. Every single thing you do is fed up the chain of command. When one of the boys gets into a brawl, it's a disciplinary issue. When you do it, it's a congressional inquiry. So I'm supposed to let them put their hands on me? Let them disarm me? Just to keep the brass happy?" "I didn't say that," Reynolds countered, stepping closer. "I'm saying you have to be smarter. You can't just break people because they're arrogant pricks. You have to beat them at the job. You have to outwork them." Outshoot them and outlast them. I do, Chief. Every single day. Harper felt the sting of hot tears threatening the corners of her eyes, born strictly out of frustration, but she forced them down violently. And it doesn't matter. I still have to fight my way out of a locker room just to clean my rifle. Reynolds looked down at the metal floor grating. He slowly shook his head, running a rough hand over his closely cropped gray hair. The recon detachment is being pulled from the rotation, Reynolds said finally. They are physically incapable of deploying, which means your fire team is moving up. We spin up in 3 hours. Night insertion. Near the Belarusian border. Cold weather gear. Live conditions. He turned toward the door, pausing with his hand on the rusted latch. Ice that cheek, Harper. You look like hell. Briefing is at 0100. The door clicked shut, leaving Harper alone in the freezing, humming silence of the shipping container. She stood still for a long time, listening to the pipes in the wall groan. Freezing wind lashed across the tarmac, carrying the bitter, metallic scent of aviation fuel and impending snow. The darkness of the Polish night was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic strobing of the MH-47 Chinook's navigation lights. Harper stood in the staging line, feeling the immense, crushing weight of her fully loaded combat kit. Her plate carrier sat tight against her bruised ribs, acting as a painful, constant compression wrap. Her night vision goggles rested heavily on her helmet mount, pulling her neck forward. She stood between Davis and Jenkins, the other 2 members of her fire team. They were quiet, professional guys. They didn't make jokes about her presence. They didn't second-guess her calls. They just did the work. "You good, Harp?" Davis asked, his voice barely audible over the high-pitched whine of the Chinook's auxiliary power unit warming up. He didn't look at her. His eyes were focused straight ahead on the dark silhouette of the helicopter. "Solid," Harper lied, adjusting the padded sling of her M4. The weapon felt reassuringly heavy against her chest. Heard Wyatt tried to walk down the stairs to the clinic and threw up on his own boots, Jenkins muttered from her left, a faint trace of amusement cutting through the freezing air. Harper didn't smile. The satisfaction had completely bled out of her, leaving only the grim reality of the mission ahead. She didn't want to be known as the woman who put 4 men in the hospital. She just wanted to be a ghost. She wanted to vanish into the operational ether, to be judged solely by the rounds on target and the intelligence gathered. The crew chief, a shadowy figure bathed in the dim green glow of the cabin lights, signaled them forward. Harper moved up the heavy metal ramp, her boots clanking dully against the reinforced aluminum. The interior of the Chinook was a sensory assault. The air tasted of hydraulic fluid and burnt kerosene. The vibration of the twin rotors spun up, shaking the floorboard so violently it rattled her teeth. She took her seat on the canvas webbing, strapping herself in with methodical, practiced movements. The cabin was freezing, the air whipping through the gaps in the fuselage, but she welcomed the cold. It numbed the throbbing in her jaw and the deep, aching stiffness in her shoulder. As the massive helicopter lifted off the tarmac, the sudden shift in gravity pulled her stomach down. The noise became deafening, an overwhelming mechanical roar that drowned out any possibility of thought. Harper closed her eyes, letting her head rest back against the vibrating canvas wall. This was the contradiction of her existence. She fought tooth and nail, sacrificed her body, endured the absolute worst of human ego and institutional prejudice, just for the privilege of sitting in a freezing, shaking metal tube flying toward people who wanted to kill her. It was utterly absurd. It was beautiful, terrible, and completely absurd. She thought about the 79 seconds in the locker room, the wet crunch of Wyatt's nose, the desperate, suffocating pressure of Lawson's grip, the primal, ugly necessity of the violence. She hadn't won anything in that room. She had just survived it. And tomorrow, or the next day, or next month, there would be another Wyatt, another Lawson, someone else who looked at her and saw a quota, a PR stunt, a liability, someone who needed to be shown, intimately and brutally, that the trident pinned to her chest wasn't a gift, It was a receipt for pain, paid in full. The red cabin lights suddenly snapped off, plunging the interior into pitch blackness. A second later, the green, ethereal glow of the night vision washed over the cabin as the team flipped their optics down. Harper reached up, snapping her dual-tube NVGs into place over her eyes. The world resolved into a grainy, emerald-tinted reality. She looked across the narrow aisle at Davis and Jenkins. They were just silent, green silhouettes, holding their rifles across their knees, swaying in unison with the violent motion of the aircraft. The crew chief held up a hand, flashing 5 fingers, 5 minutes to the drop zone. Harper took a deep, slow breath, feeling the sharp twinge in her ribs. She gripped the cold polymer handguard of her weapon, running her thumb over the safety selector switch. The aches, the bruises, the exhaustion, the endless, suffocating weight of having to prove her existence, she took it all, packed it into a tight, dense box in the back of her mind, and locked it away. The heavy metal ramp at the rear of the Chinook began to lower, groaning against the hydraulics. A blast of sub-zero wind screamed into the cabin, biting through her layers, smelling of pine needles, wet earth, and cold emptiness. The darkness outside beckoned, wide and indifferent. Harper stood up, unclipping her safety tether. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel invincible. She just felt ready. Violence is rarely pretty, and it never looks like the movies. If you want more raw, unfiltered stories from the dark corners of the tactical world, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like to let the algorithm know you're here for the real stuff. And leave a comment below. Would you have walked away, or would you have taken the 79 seconds? Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Stay sharp, and we'll see you in the next one.